So thank you guys all for coming. I'm so glad that there's so much interest up here in Taos about native bees. My hope is that you'll learn a little bit more than you knew, but listening to you guys talk, I get the sense that some of you already know quite a bit about bees. That's great to see. So this is, since you came to hear about bees, I thought I'd talk about me instead. Bees and me, they sound the same, right? This is me, the very first summer that I collected bees, and you'll see I'm wearing a satchel across here. That's this. This is the bandolier of death, as they call it. And this is my bee net. It's a golf club handle, a little bit of piano wire. This is like canvas duck, and this is wedding veil material. This is the best possible net for catching bees. It moves really fast. It's very speedy, and bees are fast, so it has to be fast too. I got my start about 20 years ago. I was an undergrad at Utah State University, and it was the beginning of my second year. I had just gotten started, and I was working at Walmart, and I hated it. Oh, man, did I hate it. And so I was looking for another job, and on the Utah State University campus job board for jobs on campus, there are all these little Post-it notes, and one of them said something about janitor and lifeguard and blah, blah, blah. And one of them said something about a museum, whatever. I didn't even read it, but it said $6.25 an hour. And all the rest said $5 an hour. That's the one I applied for. I didn't know it at the time, but I got the job and learned that I was now employed by the USDA, by a branch of the USDA called ARS, Agricultural Research Services. And they run a U.S. National Pollinating Insects Collection, which is a really long way to say a bee lab. And so in this museum, they have close to 2 million specimens now, all in these little glass drawers that you can slide out, just like your kitchen utensil drawer. It's got a glass top, and inside were bees from all over the world on pins like you all saw tonight. And they were gorgeous. They were amazing to look at. There are ones with tongues longer than the body. They curl up around it. There were greens and blues and brilliant reds and all of these things. And my boss, Terry Griswold, who it turns out is something of a bee legend now. He's been at it for a really long time and knows what he's doing, saw my interest in these insect drawers and offered me a job working in Pinnacles National Monument, helping him conduct the first ever bee survey of a national monument. Sort of wanted a laundry list of what species were there, and he asked if I would be willing to do this project. It would require taking off an entire quarter from school, camping the whole time, hiking, and looking at flowers. Was I interested?
Yeah.
So that's how I got my start. This was the very first day. I looked so timid. I really didn't know what I was doing. Terry would take his net, and he'd just kind of flick it, and he'd have a bee, and he'd take out one of his little vials and whoosh, pop a bee in there, put it back in his satchel of death, and keep going over and over again all day long. He had easily 100 specimens, and I hadn't caught one. And I finally nabbed a bee, and of all the bees I could start with, it was a honeybee, my first bee. And I had it in my net, and he handed me one of his vials and told me to put my bee into it. And figuring out how to get that bee from there into this tiny little vial was a bit of a trick for me. And in the process of trying to get that stupid thing in there, the honeybee flew up my sleeve, scared the pants off me. I dropped his vial with the cork off, and all of his bees ended up in the dirt. I lost the honeybee, and that's how I got my start in bees. Thankfully, I didn't quit. I guess I should point out, so this is cyanide crystals on the bottom of a glass vial with chromatograph paper. So it's a filter paper over the top, so the fumes come through, but it's tight. That doesn't move. So the crystals don't come out. So it's safe, but it also euthanizes the bee in seconds. And if you're going to go to the trouble, you might as well make it as fast as possible. So that's the tools of the trade. I'm glad I didn't quit. I was fascinated right away, and I've continued collecting bees and studying them for the last 20 years all over the world and all over the West, and I've had a really good time. And still 20 years later, I'm thinking of new questions to ask and answer about bees. It's been really, really exciting for me. And one of the things that I liked was that, you have to do a lot of data analysis and put things into Excel spreadsheets and make graphs and all that stuff. But with bees, you take everything that you collect in one little vial, And you pin all of those things up together. A vial represents all of the bees from one flower, or from one location, or one habitat, or one day, or something that ties all of the bees in that vial to each other. They're all the same in some way or another. And so when you pin them, you pin everything from a vial together in your box, and then the next set, and the next set. And the patterns are immediately apparent. You can see that all of the big bees come out in the morning, and that the small bees were all on such and such a flower, and that the osmia were all on something else. So you see these patterns before you put anything into an Excel spreadsheet and done any analysis, which is kind of exciting. I went on from Pinnacles to do my master's in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in southern Utah. And then went from there to, I did this sort of a big biogeography study of the whole place, but I went from there to Carbondale, Illinois. It's just in the news for the eclipse. I went to Southern Illinois University, and I focused in on just one bee and the plants that it specializes on. It's a specialist bee. And then the day that I defended, Princeton University Press called to let my co-author and I know that they would be interested in publishing this book idea that we brought up. So spent the last 3 years working on that. And Joe and I both, Joe is my co-author, we both had different reasons for wanting to write a book like this. As a PhD student, I'd found that there was a lot of interest in young incoming students to study pollination. They wanted to know more about bees and flowers and how they related to each other. But there was no beginner guide for an incoming graduate student to learn just the basics, just to get them started. And so a lot of people, when they would collect data, say what bees are visiting a penstemon, they would say bumblebee, honeybee, and other bee. And that was it. Yeah. So that to me was, there's more that can be learned from that relationship, and they had no way of answering that question. Joe, at the same time, was a brand new professor at Utah State University, actually, and was doing a lot of talks to amateur naturalists and gardeners, and realized there was this real interest in bees, but nothing approachable for people that wanted to know more about their natural history. And so we did this little survey. We put out a survey with 3 questions. We got 1,500 people to participate in our survey. And we asked just 3 questions. It was very simple. The first one was, how many bee species do you think are in the United States? Most people guessed there were somewhere less than 500. In fact, most people guessed there were somewhere less than 20. They didn't think there were that many. Right? The actual number, of course, is around 4,000. So most people don't know how many bees are out there. The next question we asked was, what does a bee look like? If we give you a series of images, can you tell us which ones are bees and which ones aren't? Most people did pretty good down in this area. Grasshopper, clearly not a bee. Everyone got that. Pretty straightforward. Flies, even some of the lepidopterans, didn't throw people. Everyone seems to know what a bumblebee looks like and a honeybee, even the sweat bees. Most people are familiar with the sweat bee. But these ones in the middle, which are all super familiar, really common bees that you can find in your backyards easily, people didn't know those were bees. They were unaware when they saw those that they were looking at a bee. Andrena, green metallic sweat bees, mason bees. And a lot of people thought that the velvet ant, which you get, I think, pretty commonly up here, thought that was a bee. So, people don't know how many there are. They don't know what bees look like. But the last question we asked was, on a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think bees are? 5 being very important. Every single person said 5. So people think bees are really, really important, even if they don't know what they look like or how many there are. To us, that seemed like a bit of a disparity, like that was a gap that we could fill. And one of the reasons is, without that knowledge, you can end up with misguided efforts towards helping bees, like this. Does anyone see a problem with this poster? That's a wasp, right? Sad part is this is put out by the NRDC, so. How about this? Does anyone know what they're looking at here? Does anyone know this? For $25.50, you too can have the shirt. With a cicada on it. There. Save the bees. This one's a little harder. I die, you die. I think the sentiment is, if pollination services go away, we don't get the fruit that we need to eat, the vegetables and stuff. So if the bees go away, we go away. The problem is, this isn't a bee, this is a fly up here. And I'm not going to say that flies aren't very important, but they don't accomplish enough of the pollination that happens in this country to really make that a fair statement. And then of course this one, the paper wasp.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not a bee. So you might wonder, okay, so if people are invested in bees, they're willing to perhaps donate to Save the Bee funds and buy shirts for $25.50 and it has a cicada on it. If people are behind the cause, what difference does it make if they don't actually know the details of these bees? And I would argue that the fact that most of these bees have their own unique life story. They all have a different story to tell. And if we really want to help them, we need to understand those stories. We need to know what bees actually need and recognize that it's a pretty diverse group of things that bees need if we want to be able to help them. So in order to do that, we need to make sure everyone knows what a bee is. Is a bee? See some nodded heads? Right? Yes, yes, this is a bee. This is a honeybee. Yes, this is a bee. Does anyone have any other kind of bees? Throw out some names of bees.
Bumblebee.
Bumblebee, great.
Honeybee.
Honeybee, yeah.
Mason bee.
Mason bees. Blue, also a mason bee, I'm thinking? Yeah, okay. The squash bees, we have sweat bees. We have all these other kinds of bees, and we know these are bees. If you start adding the list up in your head, you can probably come to more than 20, which most people think there are anyway. But what is it that unites all of these together in the category of bee? They're pretty different looking. There's a lot of diversity in the way that they look there. Well, if you zoom in on if you look at the insect family tree, this is all of the insects and how they're related to each other. Down here in the corner, you have the Hymenoptera. Bees are in the Hymenoptera, and that's a distinction they share with both wasps and ants and a couple other small little groups. And if you zoom in on just the Hymenoptera, within that part of the family tree, we used to think that ants and bees were cousin to this big group of wasps. So they were all distinct lines of branches on this family tree. Recent phylogenetic evidence has shown that, in fact, ants and bees are both embedded within the wasps. They're not separate from them. They're not cousins to them. In fact, a bee is a specialized kind of wasp. It is a wasp. Based on the genetics, you can't separate that out and say that they're not wasps. So how in the world would this happen? How does a meat-eating predatory wasp end up as a cute, fuzzy, specialized little bee that only eats pollen and nectar? Why would that transition ever happen, or how? Well, we'll never know. We can't really go back in time to piece that together, but some fossil evidence can kind of help us, kind of clue us into what might be going on here. We know that the first giant disc-shaped flowers appeared about 125 million years ago, and they looked a lot like modern-day magnolia flowers, right? Big disc-shaped things with a ball of pollen right in the center. Great place for insects to land if they're looking for a mate. There's a big platform where everyone can find each other. If you're a predatory wasp, this is a great place to find a prey. And it's thought that somewhere in the process of getting prey, they developed a taste for the pollen on the body of that insect instead of the insect that it was preying upon. That seems far-fetched, right? Why would that actually happen? Well, if you look, you do sort of a chemical analysis and a breakdown of what's inside an insect body and what's inside a pollen grain. In terms of the things that are important for the development of a baby wasp into an adult wasp, those hormones and steroids and stuff like that, they both have the same things. They have what a bee or a wasp would need to turn into an adult. So not quite as far-fetched as we might have once thought. And so by about 100 million years ago, we find the first fossilized bees. And we know that they're bees because they have specialized pollen-collecting hairs on their legs and other things that identify them as no longer predatory wasps. And today, so about 60 million years ago, bees and flowers both diversified hugely, radiated around the world, co-radiated together. And today we know that there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species of bees on Earth. Here in the U.S., somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000. And here in New Mexico, we're guessing between 900 and 1,100. So why can't I give you an exact number? Why can't I say there's 3,597 species in the United States? Two reasons. One, we're finding new species all the time. In my work in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is an area of a little shy of 2 million acres, 1.9 million acres, about 50 miles by 100 miles, so a pretty big area. We found almost 650 bee species in that area. And of those, 42 were undescribed species. So if you take them through a taxonomic key, they don't come out in it. They're not in it. They are new to science. They don't have names. They probably still don't have names because it's a long process to name a bee. But if that's just in that little area, we're finding that many new undescribed things, times that by the world and huge countries that haven't been sampled yet. There's a lot of room for discovery. New Mexico, we have the problem that it's very undersampled, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on. So we can only kind of guess at what's here based on the fact that if we find a species in Mexico and Colorado, probably in New Mexico, even though we don't have it documented here, we can kind of guess at that. A new species was found in Central Park in New York in the last 10 years or so, which they named Lasioglossum gothami. Great name for a bee in Central Park. So if you look at bee diversity and how it breaks down species richness for bees across the U.S., this is sort of the pattern. This isn't all the states, just enough to really kind of show it. And you'll see that east of the Mississippi River, there's roughly 800 species all told. That's it in that whole area. California alone has about twice that number. You'll see that Arizona and New Mexico are quite high. There's a lot of species down here. And this pattern of bee species richness being very high in the deserts holds true around the world. Well, you get birds and butterflies and beetles and whatever all reach their greatest diversity in the tropics. Bees are exactly the opposite. They like Mediterranean, dry climates, and we are the epicenter for bees in North America.
Are you talking native bees with these numbers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The earlier slides said both, and I got a little confused.
So there's about in this country there's I don't know, maybe 50 bees that have been introduced, mostly in the last 50 years or so. But all of the rest of them are native. It's in here longer than we have for sure. So how do we identify one of these bees? How do you know when you're seeing something bubbling around on a flower that it is a bee? I think you kind of have the gestalt feel for this already. You just maybe haven't practiced it a lot. Is this a bee?
Yes.
Yes, very good. Why? What is it that tells you this is a bee?
Pollen on
He's fuzzy.
Pollen on it?
Fuzzy.
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 Fuzzy's the real big one, huh? Yeah, there's a couple other things we can look for, but that's kind of the gist of it. Is this a bee?
No.
Not at all, right? It's pretty obvious, right? One looks like if you hit it with a fly swatter, it would smash to smithereens. This one's more stout. It's got a sturdy exoskeleton. If you look at the legs, flies have these skinny little back legs. They're not in the business of collecting pollen to take it back to a nest to feed their offspring. Whereas female bees, most of them have pollen collecting hairs either on the back leg or on the underside of the abdomen. But either way, they're fuzzy and have a lot of pollen collecting hairs. When these guys fly through the air, the process of flying develops a bit of an electrostatic charge on their bodies, which is opposite to what's on pollen. So when they land on flowers, quite often the pollen literally jumps over. So that hair serves a purpose. It's a big thing. Another thing to look for is the antenna. Bees find flowers by smelling them, and they smell with their antenna. So since they spend so much time looking for flowers, and male bees also find females using their antenna, the antennae tend to be long and very noticeable. In some bees, extraordinarily long. One of the common ones you'll see this time of year is a Melissodes. It's a longhorned bee, and it's all over your sunflowers right now. And the males, you can see those huge antennae on the back. Flies have these short, stubby little things kind of in the middle of the head. Makes them look almost cross-eyed, the way they're kind of set there in the center. And then, of course, if you look at the wings, that's another big characteristic. It can be hard to count wings on a bee when it's visiting your flower, but the number of wings also changes the way that the insect sits on a flower. So flies are in the order Diptera. If you break that word down, Diptera, di means two, ptera means wing, 2 wings. So 2 wings total. And when they sit on flowers, quite often they have this triangle shape. The wings kind of lay flat out. Bees, perhaps because they have so many wings that they're stacking together, the wings look stiffer and stouter. They often stand out from the body in different ways, but they don't look triangular like this. In biology, the one rule that holds fast is that there's an exception to every rule. So I'm sure one of you could find a bee that was sitting with triangle wings, but in general, They look different in the way they sit. So bees have 4 wings, 2 on either side of the body, 1, 2, 1, 2, and they're called the hind wing and the forewing. And then I think the last thing that you can look for that really helps to tell a bee from a fly is the bees are really cute and the flies are pretty ugly.
Absolutely.
No prejudice
None,
there.
right? All right, so this is where it gets a little trickier. Now we need to tell bees from wasps, and as I just told you, bees actually are wasps, so they're going to look fairly similar. So on this page, let's do a quick quiz here. How many of these images are wasps? 1, 2, raise your hand.
3.
2, 3, raise your hand for 3.
Oh, 4.
4, are these all wasps?
Yep.
Yeah. I guess in that sense. Let's rule out the true bee. So the true wasps, right? Predatory wasps. I felt like a trick question. I didn't mean it that way. So 3 of these are wasps. There are 3 wasps here and 1 that falls into the apoids, the bees. And to me, they look like predators. They look like hunters. They have these long, spindly legs that they can wrap around their prey. They have lots of spines on the legs. If you can see the mouth parts, they're often real pointy, sharp little things, whereas bees have more robust mandibles with teeth that they can use to move pebbles and dirt and all sorts of stuff. So there's big differences there. Some wasps have this long, skinny piece between the thorax and the abdomen, which can cue you in, but not all wasps have that. On the other hand, no bee has that. So if you see that, you know it's a wasp. If you don't see it, you can't necessarily rule it out. Okay, so, and they're not hairy, are they?
No.
Really not.
And they're not cute either.
They're not. You're right. You're catching on fast. Okay, so let's do this again now. How many of these are, let's say bees? 1? 1 bee?
1.
2? Raise your hand for 2. I'll let you look for a minute. It's okay. 3? 4. How many of these are bees? How many bees? I switched it because I didn't want it to be a trick question, so I did it that way. How many bees? Just the 1?
Just the
2?
one.
Okay. So these are all bees. Sorry, this is where it gets tricky. This can be a little difficult. The interesting thing is, there's a reason that all of these don't look like your typical bee. Most bees do have this look, so don't be too discouraged. But there are bees that don't look that way, and in each case, there's a reason. This is Hyleas, the clown-faced bee. You find it here, it's all over right now. They love roses. If you have wild roses, not the real modified ones, but the simple one floral whorl there. These guys will be on it. And they, instead of collecting pollen on their legs, actually ingest it and then regurgitate it back at the nest.
Say the name again.
Hyleas is the genus. Clown-faced or yellow-faced bees is the common name. And they can be quite small. They're not very big. They nest in twigs. You'll find them nesting in old sumac or elderberry or Apache plume, anything like that. They'll nest inside those penstemon stalks, all of those. So, because they eat the pollen and then regurgitate it back at the nest, no need of those pollen collecting hairs on the body. That would be a waste. That's extra effort to make those. This one here, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. This is a nomada, is the genus. They're also called cuckoo bees. And they don't collect pollen because instead they sneak into the nest of a normal bee. When the mother is gone and there's a little bit of pollen in there, they'll sneak into the nest and lay a teeny tiny egg, usually on the back of that mound of pollen where it can't be seen. And then they sneak back out, hopefully before they get caught. The mom that is making that actual nest doesn't know that little egg is in there. She finishes making everything pretty, puts her own egg in there, and seals the nest off with the bees. She doesn't know there's 2 eggs in there. And that little tiny egg was laid a little earlier, right? So it's had a few extra days to get started. It hatches first, starts to grow a little bit, and it has these, it looks like a caterpillar, but with huge scissor-like mandibles on the front of its face. Finds the other bee and snips it in half, doesn't eat it, leaves it, and eats the pollen that was meant for that other bee. So it's a parasite, a thief on the pollen. So they don't collect their own pollen, no need of those pollen collecting hairs. But you'll notice that the abdomen or the thorax on the back, the exoskeleton is real thick, like armor, to sort of protect them if they get caught in the nest. And this is a male. This is a Ceratina small carpenter bees. Their closest relative here is the real carpenter bees that you've probably seen. And males don't collect pollen. They don't contribute to taking care of the offspring, so no need of pollen collecting here either. So it can be a little tricky telling them apart. I still remember the day that I asked Terry, the guy who was my mentor and got me started in bees, how do you tell a bee from a wasp? How do you do this? And he said, well, the technical definition is that somewhere on the body of a bee there is a split end. One of the hairs will be forked or branched in some way. This is not going to work in the field, obviously. This is a terrible practical thing, but it is the true classification of bees. They all have a split hair somewhere on their body. On those hairless bees, the place that you would find it is if you think of the shoulder of a bee and it has a little, like an epaulette on its shoulder, that piece, on that little shield piece, the hairs here, see how fuzzy they are? Compared to that same structure on a wasp, they're very simple and straight. So even if there's no hair anywhere else on the bee, you could look under a microscope and find hairs there and look to see. This isn't going to work in the field, obviously. Something a little more practical is that a lot of wasps, especially this time of year, I saw this today in Bandelier, there's a lot of species that have this. The wasps have a metallic sheen to their faces. They have silvery hairs on their faces. And as they root around for nectar on a flower, that glint is real apparent. You'll never see that on a bee. So if you see a metallic gleam in the sun on it, you know it's a wasp. That's something you can look for. I think the best way is really sort of to look at the lifestyle. Like, what are they doing on the flowers? I think it's very telling. A bee, busy as a bee, is a real thing, and it really does apply to these guys. She is in the flower, madly gathering as much pollen as she can, getting a bite of nectar, and then she's off again. The wasps seem to be a little more leisurely. They're there for a sip of nectar before they go hunting again. They're often seen not on the flowers, hovering around. They dangle their legs below them, whereas bees tend to tuck their legs up close to keep that pollen close to their bodies. So the way they act on the flowers can be telling. Who do you think you're going to see at your barbecue? Chicken legs and hamburgers out. It's the predatory meat-eating wasp that's going to be the problem there. It's not a bee.
So when you say they eat meat, you mean literally meat?
Yep. So most of them, they're not eating the meat themselves in the same way that she doesn't eat the pollen. She takes it back to the nest for her offspring. They're getting meat for their babies. All of these bees we're talking about are not like the honeybee that you're used to thinking about. And I'll get into the detail of this, but the sort of take-home message about these guys is that they're mostly solitary, and I'll explain that. They nest in the ground, and many of them are specialists. This is an important message about the native bees that we'll be talking about today. They range in size from slightly bigger than a quarter in this country to smaller than a quarter, as you can see here. Both of these are bees that you find in New Mexico, so they're here. We actually have the smallest bee in North America here in New Mexico. It's called Perdita. I told someone about Perdita, but this is Perdita minima is the species name. This is a quarter for scale, and that's it right there. It specializes on Tequila flowers. Do you know this? It's in the Euphorbiaceae. It's a spurge, a kind of leafy spurge, I think is the common name. And it's found in very hot, dry places. So most people don't think of Perdita minima when they're thinking of a bee. This is what comes to mind right here. This, of course, is the honeybee. They're common. They're really important, especially for agriculture, and we use them. We use and abuse these guys. So we know them quite well. Most people, by the time they're in 6th grade, know something about bees because of the honeybee. So I'm going to go over sort of the life history of a honeybee, and then we'll compare and contrast that to a solitary bee, which represents, 99% of what's in this country. So Apis mellifera is the genus and species for this. They're highly social, and social has a true definition. There's a division of labor between individuals within the hive. There's a queen whose job is solely to lay eggs. That's all she does. There are workers, each of which has a specific task depending on how old they are and what they're doing in the nest. But there are ones that take care of the queen and take care of the babies. There are ones that forage for nectar, others forage for pollen and water. Some scout for new nesting sites. Some remove cadavers and housekeeping and that sort of thing. And that queen can live for 5 to 7 years. So because she lives so long and she's laying eggs that whole time. She gets to meet her daughters and her granddaughters and her great-granddaughters, et cetera, for many generations. So there's multiple generations all living together. The genus and species Apis mellifera, that particular species, is very long-lived, meaning that even though any one individual within the hive may live, say, 2 months, because the hive is this perennial ongoing thing, you can see that same species fly from where I am in Santa Fe about March to maybe October. By the time you get to Albuquerque, it's February to November. So long-lived for that same species. Anything that's living that long, obviously, is a generalist and will collect pollen from any flower. You can't specialize on sunflowers because sunflowers only come out in the fall, right? You'd be starving for the rest of the year. So by their very nature, they are generalists. And then, of course, they live in hives, these boxes that we can move around and stack and make taller and do all sorts of things with. Colonies can be 30,000 to 60,000 individuals within one. And then this is a real big thing. They make and eat honey. The same way that I'm going to can cucumbers when I get home. I'm going to can up some applesauce and stuff to get me through the winter when the flowers are no longer, the fruits and vegetables are no longer happening. These guys can flowers. This is canned preserves to get them through the winter. It aids in helping them maintain and live as adults through the winter, and it also helps with digestion. The honey is sort of broken down sugars that are easier to digest. And then, of course, this is a big thing. They're semi-domesticated or domesticated, depending on how you choose to define that word. But we have been manipulating honeybees in one form or another for at least 9,000 years. Our relationship with them goes back quite a ways. This here is a little bit more typical of a classic native solitary ground nesting bee. This is a Andrena species. Andrena, the genus, the common name for them is mining bees. And let me just show you how they differ from the honeybee. First of all, they're solitary. And what that word means is that each female builds her own nest. In that nest, she puts a mass of pollen that she collects by herself, and then she lays the egg that goes along with that. So she does all the things that a queen bee does, and also the things that a worker bee does. Her nest is hers all by herself. She doesn't share it with anybody else. And then she lays all those eggs with their little masses of pollen and seals off those nests. In 8 weeks or so, even less than that, after she has emerged as an adult, she's dead and gone. And her offspring come out the following year. So she doesn't meet her babies. She doesn't get to see them after she lays that egg. So how do we know anything about these bees in the ground, these ground nesting bees and what they look like? This is an Andrena nest in Illinois. When I went out to tour the school, I came across these. Maybe it was a sign. They nest individually, so each bee has its own hole, but they often nest in aggregations with many neighbors together. Each of them has their own little hole, but they're in an area all together. So sometimes you'll see these aggregations of 10 to 10,000 bees all together in one area. How do we know what those bee nests are like underground? There are people who spend their entire scientific career studying bee nests and what they're like in the ground, describing them. It's pretty simple. You get a straw, you fill it with chalk dust, and then you find one of those holes and you blow that chalk dust into the hole. And you pack that hole full, and it leaves a little white mark in the tunnel going into the ground, the chamber. And so then you can take a shovel and dig down next to that and follow that white marking, blow more dust in, blow more, etc., and follow it down till you get to the bottom. And usually in a ground nesting bee, you'll see some variation of this, where you have a series of little chambers coming off, and each one of these would have a ball of pollen in it, an egg, and then it would be backfilled. And then she'd move on and put another single egg by itself in here with pollen, backfill it, and then another here, and you can see all of the little ones. My mentor, Terry, wanted to study a bee. He found an aggregation, so a group of bees all together in the San Rafael Swell. It's an area in sort of central southern Utah. And they looked really interesting. They seemed different. The mounds of soil around them were quite large, and so they got the chalk dust in the shovel. Blow and dig, blow and dig, blow and dig. And by the end of the day, they managed to find their way to the end of one of these, 9 feet underground. 9 feet, yes. The bee is about 1/3 of an inch in size. Yeah, and they did several of these over the course of some period of time, and they were all extremely deep. Why? No one knows. No one has a clue. The thought is that perhaps consecutive generations continue to make the nest deeper. Maybe they need something to do. Who knows why? But that's not typical. Most especially like the little Perdita minima that I showed you a picture of. Their nests are just a couple inches, if that, on the surface. But there's an extreme. These guys are short-lived, so once that female has sealed off as many, provided for as many eggs and sealed off as many nest cells as she can, she has 5 to 8 weeks tops to do all of that. And then she's gone. And since all of that particular species come out at the same time, that means that, say, Osmia lignaria or Osmia ribiflorus or Perdita minima, you only see that bee from, say, the middle of May to the middle of July, and that's it, and then it's gone. It's the only time that you would see that species in any year. So it's different from the honeybee, which is ever present. Many of these, because the window is shorter, have the luxury of being specialists, so they can collect pollen from just one genus or one family of flowers. Even if other things are in bloom, they only collect pollen for their offspring from one particular kind of flower. It's usually not at the species level, usually the genus or the family. What's interesting about this is it seems to be hardwired into the brains of those bees. And if you take a twig nesting bee and kind of open the top, peel off the top of the twig, and pull out the pollen mass that a specialist bee has left for its offspring in there, say sunflower pollen, and you replace that with some other kind of pollen, say mint pollen or something, put that in there, the larvae will still eat that mint pollen that's not the thing it's supposed to specialize on, grow just fine to become an adult, and then emerge and go back to specializing on the sunflower. So it's hardwired in it. It's not imprinting. It's actually something about the way they sense flowers. So again, just to reemphasize, these guys are ground nesting. 70% of all bees in the U.S. nest in the ground. The ones that don't nest in pre-existing cavities or twigs, beetle burrows, snail shells, holes in adobe bricks, or little cracks between them, lots of places like that, but not in a hive in a box with little hexagonal cells. That's unique to the honey. And then we can manipulate these to some extent. If you drill holes in a block of wood, bees come into it, and then in the off season you move that into your orchard. Obviously when those bees come out, they may aid in the pollination of your orchard. But most of these bees are in the ground. It's impossible to move a section of a trail into your yard and use them to your advantage. So we work with them a little bit, but not to the extent that we can the honeybee. So here's the life cycle of one of these. Let's say early spring for Andrina, the mining bees. Most of them come out in the spring, so we'll go with that. Obviously, this could be rotated. If this was a summer bee, that could say summer, and the whole thing would just kind of shift down a little bit. So the bees emerge. Males usually come out first. In the early spring, you'll often see them sort of hovering over the ground, waiting for females to come up. If they smell or hear her before she's emerged from the ground, they'll dig down to her, they'll help her out in order to be the first to mate with her. As soon as the females emerge, they commence foraging and they start building their nest. As fast as they can, they start provisioning cells with as much pollen as possible. When you think about it, success from a bee's point of view is as many healthy offspring that live to adulthood as possible. That is success for any organism, really. And so since that's tied to how many eggs she can lay that survive to adulthood, she's got to work it out for her, as many pollen balls as possible. By
What
summer,
are the males doing meanwhile? If the female's foraging and building nests.
a lot of them will find a territory, a flower that they'll defend, and try and prevent any other males from coming into it, so that when any she that's the right species comes in there, he can mate with her. So they're just trying to mate with as many females as possible, and drink nectar. By summer, that adult bee is dead and gone, and all of her little eggs are most likely in the ground, in the dark, with this ball of pollen, no noise, nothing in the ground. And they spend the majority of their life, 9-10 months of their life, are spent in that little cell developing into adults. That's most of its life. So it goes through a caterpillar stage, it goes through a metamorphosis with a cocoon even sometimes, very similar to the butterfly, And out comes the almost adult bee, which then of course emerges the following year and completes the cycle. So, to show you what bee life looks like, here's a little video. This is a squash bee. These guys specialize on squash. They only collect pollen from things in the Cucurbitaceae family. Here she's got nectar and she has it on her tongue, and now she grooms it off of her tongue and off of her eyes and off of her antenna. She grooms it all onto her forelegs and then moves it from her forelegs to her mid-legs, that's the middle set there. And then from the mid-legs, she'll move it to her hind legs, which is where she stores it to get it back to the nest. And then a male finds her. She doesn't seem interested to me. She kicks him off a couple times and flies away. Repeat, repeat, repeat all day long. That's the life of a bee in a nutshell right there. So let's look at bees around the world just for fun. I'm going to go through these fast, but remember the pattern of arid, desert, Mediterranean climates being rich. That holds wherever you are in the world. As you can see here, 900 to 1,000 species in each of the Mediterranean countries. By the time you get to Finland, there's not much. They look very similar to bees that you find in North America. There's a lot of overlap even at the genus level between the two. If you look at Asia, again, the drier regions are the areas where most of the bees are found. Even in China, the drier areas of China are where those bees are. A lot of it hasn't been sampled yet, so there's a lot of room for discovery. They have some really neat bees there. The biggest bee in the world is found in, I think it's Borneo. Is that right? I think so. Megachile Pluto, that's it right here. They have bees. We have sweat bees. They have tear bees that drink the tears. This is an eyeball. That's the rim of someone's eye right here. They drink your tears. This is a carpenter bee in Asia. Isn't that gorgeous?
Beautiful.
It's the yellow one. Which one?
Yellow. Upper right.
It's related to the mining bees that we have here. In Africa, a lot of it hasn't been sampled at all, so there's a lot of room for growth in what we know about bees here. But again, the pattern holds that those Mediterranean areas are high in bees, and the tropical areas probably not as much. One of the coolest bees I think in the world is this one right here, and it specializes on a flower with a really long corolla tube, and it uses these very long front legs right here to reach into that flower tube and pull out floral oils, not pollen, but oils. Pulls them out and takes them back to the nest. Can I taste it? Hold on. Rhinolictus? Give me a minute, it'll come to me. That's gonna bug me. I'll come back to that, I'll think of it. South America, same sort of pattern with the dry areas, being the areas
I
with
don't
the
think
most
of Brazil was being dry.
Well, Brazil has some pretty dry areas
Yeah,
here.
Some, yeah.
Yep. The Amazon basin, not so much, but those dry shrublands around it where you find the anteaters and aardvarks or whatever it is you find there. That's the termite mounds. There's a lot of bees in that area. They have some social species down there, some stingless bees that you may have heard of. They have one species of bumblebee. You can see it here, Bombus galbanii. And then, of course, if you look at North America, U.S. takes the cake, but Mexico's probably per square mile not far behind. It's not as well sampled. If it is, most of it's not in databases where we know about it yet. It might be in collections somewhere. But by the time you get to the tropics, it drops out. Here's a couple of the things that you can find in North America. This is one of my favorites. All bees have 5 eyes, 2 on the sides of their head, the compound eyes, and 3 on the top. 1, 2, 3. And those 3 eyes they use to sense light and dark and orient to find their way back to the nest. And this one, you're going to ask me, this is Megalopta. I remember that one. This one, the 3 simple eyes on top of the head are huge because it flies at night and it orients using moon and starlight and late dusk light. So those eyes on top are really, really big. So yeah, bees are most diverse in those xeric and Mediterranean habitats, not so much in the tropics. What do we know zooming in on just New Mexico? It's not well sampled. There's not a lot known about New Mexico. The areas near universities, we know a little bit. Carlsbad is here, and And the bee lab, where I used to work, did a survey at Carlsbad National Park, and so we know something about the bees there. San Juan, there's a lot of rare, threatened, and endangered plants up here around Farmington, and they've done a bit of work, so we know more about that area. There's a bee course to learn about bees that's right here across the border in Portal, Arizona, at the Southwest Research Station, I think it's called, just over here, and so this area has been well sampled. The rest, not so much. So I pulled up from the databases of all the bees that have been put into Excel spreadsheets and all of that, what we know for each county in New Mexico. And here's, I don't know if I got them all on there, but I got most of them on. Here's Los Alamos. 2 species are recorded for Los Alamos. It's ridiculous. I could walk into anyone's backyard and see more than 2. They just haven't been documented. No one's taken the time to collect them, identify them, and enter them into some sort of repository where we have that information. Taos, 30 species. There's easily 400 or 500 species here, but we have not studied the area to know that for certain. There's a lot of exciting work to be done. Santa Fe County, really, I mean, with the elevational range in these 2 counties alone, there's a lot of habitats, there should be a lot there, which hopefully we'll know a little bit more about soon. There's a huge diversity here. These are all pictures of bees that I took each of these pictures in my yard in Santa Fe, except for this one I took at the Botanic Gardens in Albuquerque. All the rest of those are there. So bees abound here. Do I have more than 20 on here? We're close to what's known for New Mexico. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these so that you guys can get a sense for the kinds of bees that are all around you here that you're likely to see. This is the blue orchard bee. These come out in the early spring. They're pretty common in orchards on purpose. If you are not familiar with Sam Droge's work, he's out of the USGS Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab. He's in Maryland, but he has a setup to take these stunning pictures of bees and other insects on pins. Check out his Flickr page. It'll blow your mind. He's been featured in National Geographic and all sorts of places. But these guys are excellent pollinators of apples and pears and cherries and almonds, lots of things in the rose family. And we've spread it across the country in those little boxes where you drill holes like I talked about, and you move them from place to place. It's the closest we have to a managed native pollinator in this country. The nesting cavities that look something like this. Here's a little mud. They seal off the ends with a little bit of mud. They have nice mandibles for grabbing dollops of mud and moving it around. And if you look inside, here of course is the ball of pollen and the egg, and then a sealed little partition. Sometimes this is sawdust, sometimes it's mud, sometimes it's bits of leaf, and then another ball of pollen and another egg, etc. all the way down. So those bees are all in a row. If they're in a block like this, if she starts, let's say she starts at this end, this bee got laid first, so it's had longer to develop than this one down at this end. What's to keep this bee, when it's fully developed, from digging through all of its brothers and sisters on the way out when it's ready to go? Well, it turns out female bees have the amazing ability to decide if their offspring are going to be male or female. They get to pick the sex of their babies. And so, females are more complicated. They take longer to develop. She lays female eggs first in the back of the nest and males in the front. With the idea, we think, that in the spring everyone will be ready more or less at the same. Females are always laid at the back of those nests. Here's the cuckoo bee. We talked about the nomada. I just wanted to show you a couple pictures. They're red or yellow in color. Bees, when they see, we see from red to purple. Bees see about the same range, but shifted down a little. So they see orange through ultraviolet. So they don't see red very well, and I've always wondered if that red coloring isn't like camouflage from a bee's point of view. I don't know if that's true, but a lot of the parasites have red on them, so it makes me wonder. They only parasitize the mining bee. You'll often see them, the mining bees are in the ground, and you'll see them hiding behind a little piece of rock. And as soon as the female leaves, then they dart into the nest. So they'll wait out of sight. They don't collect pollen. Also, they don't have a nest. So at night, they can't go home or hide from rain. They'll take their mandibles and grab onto a twig, tuck their legs up tight to their body, and just go real stiff. And that's how the females and the males spend the night.
Don't they freeze if you ever get cold?
Well, that's interesting. So a lot of male bees do that at night. They don't have a nest to go to. Some of them crawl into a flower, and when the flower closes, they're inside, and they'll be nice and cozy in there. And I think the warmth of the flower helps too. All of the liquids in there. But the male bees that don't do that often aggregate when they, on the end of a stem, so you'll see like 30 males all together. During the day, they fight with each other horribly, but at night they cuddle together. But with the nomada, they don't do that. And what's interesting, and I never really put this together till just now, the nomada, when I cool them off in my fridge to take a picture of them, like they get real still, you can chill a bee and take its picture holding still before it flies away. They come to like that. Like you don't have more than 5-10 seconds with the nomada before it's ready to go after you chill it in your fridge. Maybe they respond better to cold, and maybe that's why they do. I don't know for sure, but it's an interesting correlation. So this one, several people have commented on this bumblebee because you probably are seeing it. It's pretty common throughout here. Bombus huntii, there's quite a few bumblebees in North America and in New Mexico, but this is a common one and it's easy to tell.
How big do they get?
The queens are pretty large, but the
Okay.
workers are quite small.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll walk you through that here in a second. The bumblebees are generalists, so they collect pollen from lots of different things, but they sometimes exhibit floral constancy, so in your garden you'll see them only going to one kind of flower on one collecting trip. And they'll go home and dump off the pollen and nectar, and then on the next trip they'll visit a different flower, all the same. And the life cycle of these is a little bit different than the solitary bees I was talking about. In the early spring, a queen that was born the year before and actually mated in the fall emerges. She commences foraging. She builds a nest, usually in a rodent burrow somewhere. They like burrows in the ground, little gopher burrows. She'll climb in there. She'll lay a series of eggs in little tiny pots, each with its own little nectar and pollen mixture. And then she'll sit over the top of them and vibrate her body to keep those eggs warm. They develop really fast, and that first generation of daughters, once they're done developing, emerges, and they take over collecting all the pollen and nectar. From that point on, she stays home and just lays eggs. So she starts out doing the typical solitary thing, but then converts, changes over to being more of a social bee in that sense. The daughters work all season, the nest grows and grows inside as she lays more and more eggs, and there are more and more workers. And at the end of the season, or about now, the queen produces a series of daughters and also males. The daughters that she lays at the end of the season are big. So some of you are seeing those really big bumblebees again. Those are next year's queens. So she's laying what's going to be next year's queens. She also lays a series of eggs that will become males, and those males mate with queens from other nests. They go out and meet somewhere, and then that female, when she's mated, finds a spot in the earth somewhere. She'll kind of burrow into the ground and wait, mated as a fully grown adult until the next year, and she'll start next year's cycle all over again. So she hibernates.
So her eggs are fertilized in the fall, but not laid until the next spring.
Yeah, and so what happens is that her eggs actually aren't fertilized in her body. She keeps the eggs separate from the sperm. She has an organ called the spermatheca that stores sperm. And as she lays an egg, she can choose to release sperm or not to fertilize it as it passes through. So she stores the sperm. And in fact, honeybees, those honeybee queens that live for 5 to 7 years, store sperm that whole time in their bodies.
So she's got birth control.
She's got
What you said, that in the honeybees, the males are not, just one of them has the sperm, right? One of them's been in the honeybees, right?
In the honeybees,
The females, I can't remember which way it goes, but one of them has been, it's the fertilized egg
Yes.
and one's not fertilized
Yes.
egg. Is this
Yes.
the same situation?
yes, yes, all bees have that same situation.
Okay.
In fact, I think all Hymenoptera do,
Okay.
at least the majority
And
do.
what's that again?
The wasps, the bees.
I mean, what about the fertilized?
A fertilized egg becomes a female, and unfertilized egg
Oh,
becomes a male.
gotcha.
Question, do all of the bumblebees nest in the ground versus holes in things?
I believe so, yeah. Well, I mean, there's some exceptions, like, I have a friend who had a straw bale, so it was off the ground, but she burrowed into the straw bale, but it wasn't a hole in a piece of wood. It's a chamber, it's a big chamber, and I think a mouse modified it first, and then I don't think she made a chamber inside inside the straw, but it wasn't in the ground per se.
And it wasn't in hole like.
No, definitely not.
You tell me.
What were these called again? Bombus?
Huntii. The
Huntii.
species is Huntii, yeah. There's a lot of bombus out there. I just picked one that's pretty common and fairly easy to identify. There's actually several that have that red band, but that's the most common. So the result of all of these bees doing what they do in order to survive is this, the diversity of flowers that we see everywhere. And a lot of this is the plant's answer to bees trying to steal their pollen. From the bee's point of view, success is getting every grain of pollen back to the nest, right? From a flower's point of view, success is pollen being dropped along the way somewhere
Yeah.
onto the stigma of another flower
Yeah.
of the same kind. So they need the bees, but there's a bit of a love-hate, a push-pull there. And a lot of the flower color and size and shape and scent, all of those are ways that flowers manipulate bees in order to get out of them what they want. A small corolla tube, a small flower tube, limits how many kinds of bees can fit in there. A giant carpenter bee can't fit into a small tube. There are astragalus, locoweed, right? Yeah. Locoweed that they produce some interesting nectar that has some alkaloids in it that actually makes the bees almost tipsy. They act a little inebriated when they leave, the females. And they don't groom their bodies as well after having visited some of these astragalus. And an ungroomed bee is more likely to leave pollen somewhere on the next flower. So there's lots of ways that flowers can manipulate bees. It results in that diversity of colors, but it also results in all of these things that I really like. The more in my kitchen, the better. All the colored foods in the supermarket, in the produce section there. Many of them rely to some extent on pollinators. To be fair, apples wouldn't stop existing. They wouldn't stop being if bees went away. It's just that the number of fruits that we would get would be small enough that apples would be insanely expensive. Right? So we use the bees for the economic reason of producing tons and tons of apples. An apple tree isn't stupid enough to put all of its every chance into just the bees. So of course they're happy to be pollinated by butterflies and flies and whatever else comes along. But the bees do it better, they do it more efficiently, and they allow us to get apples for $1 a piece or whatever it is now. So with that in mind, a lot of people ask me, I sometimes talk about whether bees are disappearing and sometimes I don't. And if I don't, someone always asks. Are bees disappearing? The answer to that question is we really, really don't know. With the exception of the bumblebees and the honeybee, the rest of these haven't been studied. When you think about the fact that we only know in Los Alamos that there are 2 species that have been documented, how would we know if those populations are going up and down? We haven't studied them. We don't have the before number to compare nowadays numbers to see. Maybe some of them are on the increase. And of course, each of these bees has a different story. They come out different times of year. They're probably differently affected by some of the landscape level changes that we make. So it's hard to say all bees are being affected in the same way. As far as the bees that we do know, honeybees, a while ago we came up with this term colony collapse disorder. We've since sort of gotten away from that because we've come up with actual reasons for why that colony collapse was happening. And this term's sort of going out of style now. But there are some viruses, there are mites, there are potentially pesticides. We don't know for sure dosage, time of day, the kind of pesticide. All of these things may impact these bees differently. How we treat the bees, whether they're overworked all of the time or whether they're a more healthy bee hive to start with, might impact how they're affected by pesticide. And of course, a combination of all of these may be contributing to some of the declines we've seen in honeybees. They're not in danger of going extinct per se. We're not going to lose the honeybee. A lot of the feral hives seem to be doing quite well. But it does mean that a lot of the things we rely on for bees will become more expensive.
Have you studied the effect of electromagnetic frequencies on bees at all?
The work that I've seen so one study will say that it does have an effect, and in scientific studies you usually try and have it be repeatable. And when people have tried to repeat that, they've been unable to find the same effect over and over again. So the current consensus is that it probably doesn't affect them. because we've been unable to duplicate from that original study that showed that. And so it's sort of where people are on that. Now, who knows what the next study will say? That's why you repeat. So bumblebees, of the bumblebees, a fairly intensive study was done on these. There's about 50 species of bumblebee in North America. And we have a pretty good data set for these, especially because they live in colonies. It's a little easier to study these. And so we took the historic records for all of the bumblebees and then went out and tried to resample all of the areas where bumblebees have been collected really intensively. Could we find them again in these areas? Had their range shrunk? Were they gone completely? And for all of those bumblebees, 4 of them were definitely in very significant decline. 2 on the west coast and 2 on the east coast. Interestingly, many of them are in the same subgenus, Pyrobombus. So there's some thought that they might be more susceptible to viruses or some other recent effect. A dozen or so of the species, we couldn't get enough data. There either weren't enough historical records or enough modern records to really say one way or another. But all the others appear to be holding steady, doing the same, doing just as well. Some of them even seem to be expanding in their ranges. So even within the genus Bombus, it's hard to say all Bombus are in decline. Each species is unique. And for the rest of these, we really don't know. I think I made that clear when I talk about 30 bees known here. Ceratina, Melecta, some of these things have never been collected here before. So when I collect them now, does that mean they've suddenly appeared? Are they growing in population? We don't know. So one of the things I'm trying to do is establish some standardized plots that are sampled in the same way across a season, across years, and so we can slowly establish that baseline and compare what bees are doing now to what bees are doing then. And interestingly, I set up plots when I was working in Grand Staircase Escalante for my master's. And one of the things that we found was that bee populations naturally vary quite a bit from year to year. They are similar to seed banks, and if it doesn't look like a good year, a lot of those desert bees will actually wait in the ground for a whole year. It seems like a drought. It's called bet hedging, and they'll just wait it out until a good year. They may be able to wait up to 7 years before they come out. And so that means that in a good year, all of a sudden there will be this huge increase, thousands of bees, and in the next year, nothing. But does that mean there are none, or just that they didn't come out? Piecing that out could
They
be
just sense the
required
moisture
long
content
term.
in the earth.
We're still figuring out how bees know when to come out, but barometric pressure, even in the soils, moisture levels in there, temperature might have something to do with it, and perhaps some cues we haven't figured out yet.
It's Mother Nature.
So I hope I made it clear that these bees, there's a lot of stories here. There's 4,000 stories just in North America. Each of them is different. Each of them is unique. All of them are beautiful. If we want to help these guys, we need to understand that. Putting a honeybee hive in your backyard isn't going to help native bees. If anything, there's mounting evidence that it might provide competition for the bees that were already there. In areas where floral resources are scarce, like deserts, and flowers aren't real plentiful, you may have made a limited resource where it didn't used to be one. So something to keep in mind when people say save the bees. Which bee are you looking to save? If the honeybee is where your heart is, by all means, put in the hive, but it's not helping the other ones that are here. Helping out bees is quite simple, really. On a grand scale, you need food, flowers, and nesting habitat. As far as the ground nesting bee, there is a habitat already there for all of them. As long as you don't pave it, they will find it, they will come. This little halictus, it's a sweat bee, is nesting right in here at the base of this. Joe, my co-author, put in this garden in his front yard, and bam, the halictus the next year were there, just like that. So there are bees that like sand and clay and silt, some like slope, some like it flat. There's a bee for every kind of soil. You can't really prepare for that, so don't worry about that too much. If you want to provide for the cavity nesters, you can put in bamboo, you can put in straws, you can drill holes in a piece of wood. Around here, 3/8 of an inch or smaller is probably where you want to be. Make sure those holes are at least 5 inches, closer to 7 inches deep, because she won't lay those female eggs if it's too narrow. She doesn't walk far enough back to trigger the thought, I should lay some female eggs. So think about that. Make sure those holes are deep, and it requires a special drill bit to make them that deep. And know also that you're changing the nature of these bees when you provide a permanent home that doesn't move. Think about a lot of these bees that maybe nest in penstemon or yucca stems or something like that. That yucca stem is there for a year and it's gone the next year, right? And they move on, the next generation moves somewhere else. So because of that, it's harder for parasites to find them. It's harder for mold and fungus and various things to build up in a nest. When you provide a permanent habitat, that parasitic load can increase over time. So they require maintenance. You need to remove those from time to time. You need to move it around your yard, clean them out if you really want to be helping the bees. As far as plants, you guys all like plants, I think, plant society, I would think so. So this is probably not something you really need to know about, but it's pretty simple. Just plant one something. If it goes well, plant something else. Add to it. And if that goes well, keep adding from there. I suggest to new novices in this to start with the sunflower family, just because they're big, easy flowers, and it's so easy to be successful with the sunflower. Natives versus non-natives, bees like both, which is probably part of the reason non-natives are so successful, is that they can attract a lot of pollinators. But know that when you put in those non-natives, you're probably pulling bees away from the native plants in your yard. So from the bees' point of view, it's not a big deal. From the native flowers' point of view, you've added a source of competition. Cultivars, I say generally avoid them. We haven't looked at all of them, so there's probably some where it's not an issue. But a lot of times those extra petals and stuff happen at the expense of quality nectar and pollen. Aren't as good. Include a diversity of colors and shapes and sizes, different families, of course. Don't forget your garden. Gardens are great for bees. Mix the vegetables with the flowers. Native bees, these are desert-adapted creatures. They don't need water. You don't need to put out a bowl of water for them. Honeybees are a different story, but native bees, solitary bees around here, they live in the desert. These guys were here before we started putting out bowls of water, and they did just fine. They get their water from the nectar, of course. And then remember that many of these bees are very, very small. So if you put habitat or tubes or straws or something on one side of your house and your garden flower bed on this side, they may not find that. Make sure everything's connected. Connect your habitats together. And I'll quit there. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes?
There's a lot of bees around like the Russian sage now. What type of bees are they?
Probably my experience has been that honeybees love that Russian sage. Other bees will visit too, but I think it's a really good nectar producer, and since honeybees need that nectar to make the honey, they really, really like Russian sage. Yes?
I read somewhere that the native bees can pollinate 1,000 times more than a commercial honeybee. Is
So,
that true?
well, think about that statement a little bit. Native bees is a pretty big group. So, right, probably the Perdita are terrible at pollinating apples. But Osmia lignaria has been shown to be a better pollinator than the honeybee in some of these trees. So yes, some bees are probably better than the honeybee and some are definitely worse.
And then a follow-up to that, if someone was a commercial apple grower, why would it be, and they don't want to make honey, why would it be worth their while? What's the advantage to bring commercial bees in versus just supporting a colony of natives?
So if you
What's
want,
their reason?
right, so if you want a good apple crop, do you call it a crop with orchards? Is it still a crop?
I think so.
Yeah.
Bushels, how many bushels, whatever. You need to inundate your orchard with billions of bees so that every single possible opportunity for seed set happens, so that every flower turns into an apple. If you rely only on the native bees that are already there, they'll certainly pollinate, but probably, let me back up a little. So think about this from the point of view of the ecosystem. If there were more bees than there was floral resources, those bees would die, and the next year there would be the right amount of bees for those floral resources, right? So there's going to be less bees than there are flowers in a natural ecosystem. So but that means that not every flower turns into an apple. So if you want everyone, you have to overload the ecosystem so that there's not enough flowers for every bee, but every flower has at least 3 bees, right? So you're switching the balance there. So if you just rely on native pollinators, the natural ones that are there, they're not going to pollinate every
There
apple.
wouldn't be enough.
Yeah.
So that's one good reason. Could another reason be that if the native bees were there and they stayed there, and even the organic orchards like up in Washington, they spray as soon as the commercial guys are gone, they spray, they kill all the natives. So is one of the reasons that the commercials will go away, which is convenient if you want them to spray?
Maybe. A lot of the spraying happens before the honeybees come too. One of the things they spray for is to kill any native flowers that might be attempting to come up underneath, because the honeybees are generalists, right? So if there's another flower, they'd go to the clover if it's under there, but that pulls from the apples, so kill everything underneath. So the only thing they have to visit is apples, and you'll get the best apple crop. And so once those apples go, the apple flower goes away, it's literally a desert from a bee's point of view. So there's nothing to sustain bees long-term there, because we purposefully get rid of whatever native natural flowers might be growing.
There's probably a few good reasons.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah, no, it's not so much here, yeah.
Okay, now, the native bees are vegetarian like the honeybees there?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, there
Just the
is,
wasp or
like
the
I said,
native
every scenario in biology has one exception. So there is one wasp that is a pollen eater that specializes on penstemon of all things. And we have it here, it's adorable, I just said that about a wasp. It's yellow and its antennae have little clubs at the end, so it's really distinctive. You can see these little teardrops at the end of the antenna. And there is one bee that eats decayed, what's the word I want? Dead matter. What's the word I want? Carrion, that's it, thank you. Carrion. There is one bee that eats carrion. It's really, really tiny and it looks